Emma Hayes woke to the sound of knuckles rapping against frosted glass. The Honda Civic's windows had fogged over during the night, trapping what little warmth two bodies could generate in a space designed for commuting, not living. She blinked against the dashboard clock's glow, 2:47 a.m., and knew before looking up that this would be another eviction from another parking lot. The security guard's flashlight beam cut through the condensation. His voice carried the practiced weariness of someone who'd delivered this speech before. "Ma'am, you can't stay here. Store policy." Beside her, Lily stirred in the passenger seat, wrapped in a sleeping bag that smelled faintly of mildew. 8 years old and already learning that home was wherever they could park for a few hours without being chased away. Emma's hand found her daughter's shoulder, steadying her before the fear could fully wake. "We're leaving." The words scraped out of Emma's throat, dry from sleeping with her mouth open. She turned the key in the ignition, praying the engine would catch on the first try. It did, sputtering to life with a rattle that spoke of deferred maintenance and mounting desperation. The Walmart parking lot's fluorescent lights painted everything in shades of defeat as Emma pulled onto the empty highway. Lily pressed her face against the window, breath creating new clouds on the glass. Her voice came out small, the question she'd stopped asking weeks ago, suddenly surfacing again. "Mommy, when do we get a house?" Emma's fingers tightened on the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. The dashboard showed $37.42 in the ashtray, their entire liquid assets carefully counted that evening before sleep. Enough for maybe 3 more days of gas station food and bathroom access. After that, she had no answer that wouldn't terrify them both. "Soon, baby, soon." The lie tasted like copper on her tongue. 3 months ago, Emma had stood in a glass-walled conference room 60 stories above Chicago's Loop, staring at blueprints that would define her career. The Lakeside Heights project, 42 floors of luxury condominiums, granite countertops, and floor-to-ceiling windows, promising views of Lake Michigan that would sell for millions. Her boss had laid the safety report across the mahogany table, a Mont Blanc pen positioned beside it like a weapon. "Sign off on the foundation analysis, Reynolds. The concrete mixture is close enough to spec." Emma had studied the numbers for the third time that morning, her architectural training screaming warnings that wouldn't stay silent. The load-bearing calculations were off by 12%. Not catastrophic on paper, but in an earthquake zone with 42 stories of weight pressing down on compromised concrete, the margin of error became a death sentence waiting to happen. "This building will collapse in a seismic event. I can't sign this." Her boss, Marcus Thornton, senior partner, a man who measured worth in billable hours and client retention, had smiled the way people do when they've already decided your future. "Then you're fired. Security will escort you out." 2 men in navy blazers had materialized at her elbows before she could gather her personal effects. The walk through the office had been silent, except for the whisper of colleagues turning away, protecting themselves from association with the troublemaker. Her desk drawers remained locked behind her 17 years of career mementos, abandoned because admitting structural flaws was apparently worse than building tombs disguised as luxury housing. The elevator ride down had taken 43 seconds. She'd counted each one, watching floor numbers descend while her life imploded in digital increments. Home that evening had revealed a different kind of demolition. The apartment locks had been changed. Her husband, Marcus, not the boss Marcus. Her husband, the man she'd married believing in better and worse, stood in the doorway with a folder of papers that screamed legal documents and irrevocable decisions. "I filed this morning. Lawyers inside." Emma had stared at him, this person who'd shared her bed for 9 years, who'd held Lily in the delivery room and promised forever in a garden ceremony their combined families had attended. The words didn't immediately connect to meaning. Filed what? Filed where? "I can't be married to an unemployed troublemaker. My firm can't handle the association." The cognitive dissonance had lasted maybe 3 seconds before reality caught up. Marcus worked for the development company that held Lakeside Heights' financing. Her refusal to sign hadn't just cost her the job. It had made her a liability to everyone in her orbit. The bank accounts, her voice had sounded distant, like someone else was asking. "Joint assets are now solely mine. Your name was removed this afternoon. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises." Lily had been at school during the initial confrontation, spared the worst of it, but children sense seismic shifts in their worlds, and by the time Emma collected her from aftercare with 2 trash bags of hastily grabbed belongings, her daughter's eyes held questions that deserved better answers than Emma could provide. The first night in the car, they'd told themselves it was an adventure, camping but in the city. By the second week, when Emma's calls to former colleagues went unreturned and her resume disappeared into the void of automated rejections, adventure had curdled into survival. 3 months later, survival had worn grooves so deep that Emma sometimes forgot what not being desperate felt like. The phone rang at 6 a.m., jarring Emma from half sleep in a rest stop parking lot outside Gary, Indiana. Unknown number, area code she didn't recognize. Scam call, probably. Or maybe another creditor who tracked down her cell number. She almost let it go to voicemail before something instinct, desperation, the wild hope that sometimes surfaces in drowning people made her answer. Ms. Hayes, this is Walter Monroe. I'm an attorney in Ridge Valley, West Virginia. Emma's brain struggled to connect West Virginia with anything in her life. She'd never been there, didn't know anyone from there. Her father had mentioned it once, maybe in the years before he'd stopped mentioning anything to anyone. Your father, David Hayes, passed away 6 months ago. I've been handling his estate, and there are some matters that require your attention. The words landed without immediate impact. Her father had been dead to her for 15 years, ever since he'd stopped showing up to birthdays and holidays, until even phone calls became annual obligations he'd eventually abandoned. Learning he was actually dead felt more like confirming what she'd already mourned. What could he possibly have left worth discussing? Beside her, Lily was waking up, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Emma kept her voice level, not wanting to explain complicated grief to an 8-year-old before breakfast. Walter Monroe's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering news he suspected would be unwelcome. 3 railroad cars on Highland Pass in West Virginia and a bank account with $2,400. The property was purchased in 1985 for $1. It's remote, but legally yours. Emma almost laughed. Her father, the railroad engineer who'd chosen tracks over family, had left her more tracks. The symmetry was so perfect it hurt. I'm homeless, Mr. Monroe, living in my car with my daughter. I inherit abandoned train cars. That's the universe's idea of help. The lawyer paused, and in that silence, Emma heard something shift. There's also a letter. Your father left specific instructions that you read it before making any decisions about the property. I can email it or email it. She hung up before he could offer condolences she didn't want. The phone buzzed 30 seconds later with an attachment. Emma stared at the preview image, yellowed paper, her father's precise engineer's handwriting, the kind of careful penmanship that measured distances and calculated load-bearing weights, and couldn't bring herself to open it yet. Who was that, Mommy? Lily was watching her with those enormous brown eyes that saw too much, understood too much for someone who should still believe in Santa Claus and happy endings. Someone about Grandpa David. The grandpa I never met. Yeah, baby, that one. Emma counted the money in the ashtray again as if the total might have changed. $37.42 stared back at her, immutable and insufficient. The Greyhound station was visible from the rest stop, its neon sign promising destinations that might as well be Mars for all the accessibility they represented. Except now there was an account with $2,400. Enough for bus tickets. Enough for a reset, however strange the coordinates. She opened the email. The letter began without preamble, her father's voice emerging from pixels with the same distance he'd maintained in life. Emma, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're desperate enough to come. He'd known, somehow across years of silence and geographic separation, he'd predicted the trajectory that would bring her to his words. The realization made her skin prickle with something between anger and awe. I know you hate me. You should. I wasn't there for your 10th birthday, your graduation, your wedding, but I was doing something, building something. Those train cars aren't junk. They're a fortress, a witness, a weapon. The letter continued across 2 pages, each line unveiling a history Emma had never suspected. In 1975, her father had witnessed a man named William Marshall die in what was officially called an accident, a train derailment on the Highland Line blamed on operator error and faulty maintenance. But the brakes had been cut. The evidence Marshall was carrying, documentation of environmental crimes that would have destroyed his family's mining company, had disappeared in the wreckage. I spent 30 years collecting proof, hiding it, preparing it, for you. The words blurred as Emma's eyes filled against her will. Her father hadn't forgotten her. He'd been building her an inheritance that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the choice she'd made 3 months ago in that Chicago conference room. Integrity over safety. Truth over comfort. The documents are in the dining car. Panel 7, north wall. Finish what William started. What I couldn't. Forgive me if you can. Lily had fallen back asleep, her breathing the only sound in the car besides Emma's pulse hammering in her ears. West Virginia was 800 miles away. The bus would take 14 hours with transfers cutting deep into that $2,400, but leaving enough for supplies and a margin against immediate disaster. Emma looked at her daughter, at the sleeping bag that doubled as her bed, at the trash bags in the back seat that held everything they owned. No job prospects, no references that wouldn't poison any application, no path forward that didn't involve choosing between principles and survival. Except maybe this incomprehensible gift from a man who'd abandoned her to motherhood, but apparently never stopped watching. Who'd known she would need a fortress even if she didn't understand why yet. "Okay, Dad," the words came out to the empty morning. "Let's see what you built." The Greyhound station smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee, decades of desperate journeys compressed into linoleum and plastic seating. Emma bought 2 tickets to Ridge Valley with money that felt both real and imaginary, an inheritance that hadn't existed yesterday already evaporating into transportation and hope. The clerk barely looked at her, just processed the transaction, and handed over printed confirmation for a departure in 3 hours. Lily perked up at the mention of a real bus ride, something that resembled adventure instead of another night cramped in the car. They ate breakfast at the attached McDonald's, splitting an Egg McMuffin and hash browns, because the $37 in the ashtray still mattered, still had to stretch until the bank in West Virginia acknowledged her father's account and made that $2,400 tangible. The bus, when it finally arrived, was half empty and smelled faintly of industrial cleaner, trying to mask the accumulated humanity of cross-country travel. Emma chose seats near the back, away from the restroom, but close enough to move quickly if Lily needed it. Her daughter pressed against the window, immediately watching Gary, Indiana give way to smaller towns and eventually rolling countryside. 14 hours provided too much time to think and not enough to sleep. Emma opened her father's letter on her phone again, studying the words for subtext and hidden meanings. Those train cars aren't junk. They're a fortress, a witness, a weapon. What did that mean practically? How could abandoned railroad cars in the Appalachian Mountains be any of those things? The document's angle made more sense. Her architectural background had taught her how evidence could be hidden in structures, how spaces could serve purposes beyond their obvious function. If her father had spent 30 years collecting proof of something, the train cars were both storage and statement, a monument to persistence that nobody would think to search, because who looks for crucial evidence in decrepit metal shells? "Mommy, what are we going to find there?" Lily had been drawing in a dollar store notebook, filling pages with crayon renderings of houses that all looked more stable than their current reality. Now she was looking up with the particular intensity children deploy when they sense adults are hiding significant information. "I'm not sure yet, baby. Grandpa left us something, but I don't know exactly what it looks like." Like a treasure, Emma considered the question. Treasure implied gold, jewels, things that could be converted to security and comfort. Her father's letter suggested something more complicated, responsibility disguised as inheritance. But 8-year-olds needed simple narratives, and maybe treasure was close enough to the truth. Maybe a different kind of treasure. We'll see when we get there. The hours bled together, the states passing in sequences of highway and rest stops. Emma dozed in fragments, never fully sleeping, always aware of Lily beside her and the unknown destination approaching with every mile. Somewhere around the West Virginia border, the landscape began to change, flatter farmland, giving way to rolling hills, then proper mountains that rose like questions against the horizon. Ridge Valley's bus station turned out to be a bench beside a general store on a single main street. Population 800, according to a faded sign near the post office. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where strangers were marked immediately by their unfamiliarity. Emma stepped off the bus with Lily, their combined belongings fitting in 2 backpacks and 1 duffel bag, and felt the weight of curious eyes from the handful of people visible on the street. The general store was closed, a handwritten note on the door promising return tomorrow. No taxi stand, no Uber availability. When Emma checked her phone, according to the map Walter Monroe had emailed, Highland Pass was 8 miles northeast, accessible by a Forest Service road that ended 3 miles from the actual train cars. The final approach was on foot, following abandoned railroad tracks that hadn't seen active use since 1975. Emma stood on the sidewalk as the bus pulled away, dust settling in its wake, and contemplated the impossibility of hiking 8 miles with an 8-year-old and everything they owned. The sun was already declining toward late afternoon. They had maybe 3 hours of daylight remaining. Starting now meant arriving after dark, assuming Lily could even manage the distance. Waiting meant sleeping rough in a town where they knew no one and had no resources. "Can I help you folks?" The voice came from behind, female and older, carrying the particular accent that marked Appalachian roots. Emma turned to find a woman in her late 60s, Asian American, with weathered skin that spoke of outdoor work and mountain sun. She was holding a reusable shopping bag from the general store, car keys visible in her other hand. "We're trying to get to Highland Pass. The train car's there." The woman's expression shifted immediately, recognition sparking in dark eyes. She studied Emma with sudden intensity, gaze moving from face to hands, to the way she stood as if reading biography in posture and features. "You're David's daughter. I can see it in your eyes." The statement landed like prophecy, specific and unsettling. Emma hadn't mentioned her father's name. This stranger had identified her through genetics or intuition or possibly information Emma didn't yet understand. "Margaret Chen." The woman extended her hand, grip firm and calloused. "I looked after the property for your father. He talked about you." Emma shook, processing this new data. Her father had talked about her. To someone in West Virginia. To someone who'd apparently maintained whatever existence he'd carved out in these mountains while claiming to have no family worth mentioning. "Can you take us there to the train cars?" Margaret's gaze dropped to Lily, then to the duffel bag. "I can, but it's almost dark. The trail isn't safe at night, even knowing it well. You're welcome to stay at my place tonight. Head up in the morning." Emma's instincts warred between desperation and caution. Accept help from a stranger or attempt an 8-mile hike in failing light with her daughter. The equation wasn't really close. "That's generous, thank you." Margaret's pickup truck was a Ford from the early 2000s, paint faded but engines solid. Lily climbed into the back seat without prompting exhaustion, finally catching up with excitement. Emma sat in front, hyper-aware of being in debt to someone whose relationship to her father remained undefined beyond property management. They drove through Ridge Valley's compact downtown, one stoplight, a diner, hardware store, post office, church, before turning onto a county road that climbed into genuine mountain terrain. Margaret drove with the ease of someone who knew every curve, never touching the brakes more than necessary. "Your father came here every 2 or 3 months for 30 years. The words were offered carefully, like someone testing ice before committing weight. Emma waited, letting silence create space for more. "Always working on those train cars, fixing, building, improving. Never said why, exactly. But he talked about you. Showed me newspaper clippings when you made partner at that architecture firm. Was proud even if he couldn't tell you directly." Emma's throat tightened. The firm that had fired her, that had become a crater in her professional biography, had once been something her father followed from a distance. The dissonance made her dizzy. "Why couldn't he tell me directly?" Margaret's hands shifted on the steering wheel. Fear, probably. Guilt. The longer he stayed away, the harder it got to come back. And there were complications. Things he was protecting you from. The road narrowed to gravel, climbing steeper. Forest pressed in on both sides, deciduous trees, mixing with pine in patterns that spoke of elevation and climate. Margaret navigated with practiced precision, taking them higher into terrain that felt increasingly remote from civilization's easy comforts. What kind of complications? The kind that got William Marshall killed in 1975. The kind your father spent 3 decades documenting, hoping someday someone would listen. They reached a small clearing where the road ended in a loop designed for turning around. Beyond it, a trailhead marked the beginning of a footpath that disappeared into deeper forest. Margaret parked and killed the engine, turning to face Emma directly. "Your father wasn't just a railroad engineer, he was a witness to something terrible. The train cars, they're more than shelter. They're evidence. And the people who wanted that evidence buried are still around, just wearing different names now." Before Emma could ask what that meant, Margaret was already climbing out, gesturing for them to follow. The trail was well maintained compared to Emma's expectations, wide enough for single file marked with occasional painted blazes on tree trunks. Margaret led them into the forest with Lily between them, Emma bringing up the rear, and trying to process information that kept expanding the scope of her father's secret life. A mile in, the trail intersected old railroad tracks, rails so overgrown with moss and leaf litter they were barely visible. But the grade was unmistakable, cut into the mountainside with the precision of engineering that predated modern equipment. Margaret turned to follow the tracks eastward, stepping carefully over rotted ties and debris accumulated across decades of abandonment. Highland Line ran from Charlottesville to Ashland, stopping at mining towns along the way. Closed in '75 after the accident that killed William Marshall. Company went bankrupt, trying to cover up the real reasons. Lily had grown quiet, either tired or sensing the adult's tension. Emma took her daughter's hand, navigating the uneven footing, while half her attention tracked Margaret's revelations. The accident wasn't an accident. Her father had witnessed murder, then spent 30 years not in hiding, but in preparation. The train cars were coming into focus as something other than nostalgic preservation. The tracks curved around a shoulder of the mountain, and suddenly the forest opened into a small plateau. Emma stopped walking, breath catching in her throat despite expecting this moment. Three train cars sat on a level stretch of track that ended at the plateau's edge, where the mountain dropped away to reveal valley views that stretched for miles. The cars were weathered, but intact blue paint faded to ghostly gray, green ivy crawling up the sides and small trees growing between rails. But the structure underneath was solid. Emma's architectural eye registered that immediately. These weren't ruins. They were buildings disguised as abandoned rolling stock, maintained and reinforced beyond what casual observation would reveal. Lily gasped beside him. "It's beautiful, Mommy." And it was. Positioned against the backdrop of Appalachian Mountains in late afternoon light, the train cars possessed an unlikely grace. They shouldn't work aesthetically, industrial equipment decomposing into landscape, but somehow the combination of human engineering and natural reclamation created something that transcended both. Margaret approached the first car, pulling a large iron key from her jacket pocket. "Your father gave me this for emergencies, but it's yours now, all of it." Emma accepted the key, metal cold and heavier than expected. The passenger car's door opened with a shriek of protest hinges that hadn't been used in months, complaining about the movement. The smell that escaped was complex must in old leather, metal, and wood dampness cut with something chemical that might be preservative. Inside the car stretched 67 feet rows of bench seating, facing forward toward where a locomotive would have been. Windows lined both sides, many cracked but few completely broken. Dust covered every surface in thick layers, motes dancing in shafts of light that penetrated dirty glass. But underneath the decay, structural integrity was obvious. Floorboards solid when Emma tested them. Ceiling intact except for water stains mapping old leaks. Walls reinforced with additional framing her father had installed, visible in the exposed sections. This was habitable. Not comfortable, not modern, but fundamentally sound in ways her professional training recognized immediately. Her father had built them a house disguised as wreckage. The realization made her want to laugh and cry simultaneously. Lily ran to the far end, footsteps echoing in the empty space. Mommy, look, more cars. The passenger car connected to a dining car through a coupling that had been permanently sealed with welded metal. Emma followed her daughter into the second space, and this one took her breath away for different reasons. Curved observation windows dominated one wall, floor-to-ceiling glass that transformed the mountain view into panoramic art. A long counter ran down the other side, original dining car service area, reinforced and treated, but still recognizable. Booth seating lined the walls between windows. This wasn't just structure. This was vision. Her father had transformed industrial equipment into something that honored its original purpose while creating new possibility. "The dining car's in better shape," Margaret said from the doorway. "David finished winterizing this one last fall. The freight car is driest overall. That's where he kept his tools and supplies." Emma moved through the space, slowly taking inventory with hands and eyes. A small camping stove in one corner, propane tank beside it. Water jugs stacked near the counter, treated, sealed, labeled with dates from 6 months ago. A sleeping bag folded precisely on one bench. Her father's temporary quarters during his visits, reduced to essential functions. On the makeshift table, a coffee cup sat next to a small journal. Emma picked up the notebook, opening to the last entry dated October 15th. "Winter prep complete, roof patch holding, water system functional. Hope Emma finds this when she's ready. Hope she forgives me." The handwriting was her father's, unmistakable in its precision. The date was 2 weeks before his death. He'd been here working, hoping right up until the end. Building something for a daughter he couldn't face but never stopped loving. Emma's vision blurred with tears she'd been holding back since Walter Monroe's call. This was grief, finally, for the relationship that had existed in absence and distance, but apparently never in indifference. Her father had been present in the only way he knew how, through engineering, through preparation, through creating spaces that could shelter when he could not. "Mommy, why are you crying?" Lily was back, concern pulling her features tight. Emma knelt to her level, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Because Grandpa built us something special, and I'm sad I never got to thank him. Can we live here for real?" Emma looked around the dining car at the view that would wake them each morning, at the bones of shelter her father had spent 3 decades perfecting. No electricity, no running water beyond what they collected and purified, no internet or heating beyond the wood stove Margaret had mentioned. But 4 walls and a roof, which was more than they'd had yesterday. and apparently somewhere in these cars, evidence of crimes her father had promised she could use. Yes, baby, this is our home now. Margaret cleared her throat gently. I'll leave you both to settle in. There's firewood stacked behind the freight car, and I left some supplies last month, dried goods, matches, batteries. Your father's toolbox is in there too, with all his notes and plans. He wanted you to have everything. She moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. There's a man in town named Frank Morrison. He owns the diner on Main Street. Find him tomorrow. He knew your father and William Marshall. He can tell you the rest of what you need to know. Before Emma could ask what that meant, Margaret was gone, footsteps receding along the trail until even their echo faded into mountain silence. Emma and Lily stood in the dining car as shadows lengthened and the last direct sunlight painted the valley gold. This was it then, the destination they'd traveled 14 hours to reach. Abandoned train cars on a forgotten piece of track holding secrets that had cost at least one man his life and consumed her father's existence for 3 decades. Lily tugged her hand. Can we explore the other car? The freight car was the most utilitarian of the three, built for cargo rather than passengers. But it was also the most intact, with fewer openings for weather to penetrate and solid walls reinforced with additional metal plating. Inside, Emma found exactly what Margaret had described her father's workshop, preserved like a museum to competence and preparation. A massive steel toolbox dominated one corner, easily 6 feet long and 4 feet tall. Emma opened it with the key Margaret had given her, revealing organization that made her throat tight. Every tool had its place cleaned and oiled against rust. Hammers, wrenches, saws, chisels, planes, a craftsman's collection maintained with the care of someone who understood tools were the interface between intention and reality. Beneath the top tray, she found notebooks, engineering journals filled with her father's precise handwriting and detailed sketches, train car schematics, renovation plans, structural calculations spanning years of work. Each page documented another phase of transformation, turning abandoned rolling stock into habitable space. Emma pulled out the oldest notebook, dated 1985. The first entry stopped her cold. Purchased 3 Highland Line cars today for $1 from bankruptcy trustee. Emma is 10 years old. By the time she needs this, it will be ready. He'd known 23 years before she lost everything, before she became homeless, before she needed sanctuary, her father had started building it. The prescience was either lunacy or profound faith in pattern recognition. Either way, it had proven accurate. She flipped to a middle section dated 2010. Emma made partner at Meridian Design today, saw the announcement online. So proud. Wanted to call her. But what would I say? Hey daughter, I abandoned. I've been building you a train house you don't need. Better to finish this. Leave it ready. She'll understand when she needs it. Not before. Lily was examining the supplies Margaret had mentioned: canned goods, rice-dried beans enough for a week if they were careful. Emma let her explore while she continued reading each entry, building a picture of obsession justified by outcome. Her father had been right about everything. She'd needed integrity more than success. She'd needed shelter outside conventional systems. She'd needed his preparation even if she'd never needed his presence. The final notebook was thinner, more journal than technical manual. Emma almost didn't open it, some instinct suggesting this would hurt in ways structural calculations wouldn't. But she needed to know, needed to understand what Margaret meant about evidence in William Marshall and complications that had kept her father away. The last dated entry was from 6 months ago, written in handwriting that wavered with what might have been illness or emotion. Doctor says time's shorter than we thought. Won't see Christmas. Considered calling Emma, telling her everything. Decided against it. Some truths are better discovered than told. She'll find this place when she's ready, when she needs it. Hopefully the train will tell her what I never could. Emma closed the notebook carefully, as if rough handling might damage something already gone. Her father had died knowing she'd come here eventually. Had died trusting his engineering would outlast him, would speak on his behalf when he couldn't. The faith implicit in that choice was staggering. Mommy, I found something. Lily was crouched near a bench in the passenger car, visible through the coupling. Emma joined her, finding a section of floor panel that had worked loose, not damaged, deliberately designed to lift. Emma hooked her fingers under the edge and pulled, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. Inside lay a metal box roughly the size of a hardcover book, made of something that looked like brushed steel. No lock, just a simple latch. Emma lifted it out, surprised by the weight, and carried it to the dining car where light was better. The latch opened smoothly, mechanism still functioning despite years of storage. Inside, Emma found documentation that redefined everything Margaret had implied. Manila folders paper yellowed but protected. Black and white photographs showing dead fish floating in discolored streams. Landscape shots of mining operations, sludge ponds, runoff channels leading to residential areas. Each image dated and labeled with precise locations and chemical measurements. Underneath, geological survey maps marked with contamination patterns. Water test results showing mercury, arsenic, benzene in concentrations that would trigger immediate EPA response. Handwritten affidavits on letterhead from Marshall Mining Corporation signed by someone named William Marshall and witnessed by David Hayes, railroad engineer. Emma read the central document twice, then a third time because the implications were too large to accept on first pass. I, William Marshall, being of sound mind, do hereby testify that Marshall Mining Corporation, under direction of CEO William Marshall Sr., has deliberately contaminated groundwater sources in Highland Valley, West Virginia, through improper disposal of chemical waste products. Evidence of contamination has been suppressed through falsification of test results and bribery of local officials. This affidavit is made in the public interest and against my family's financial interests because the health impacts to local residents constitute ongoing criminal negligence. The date was June 1975. The signature was notarized and witnessed by her father's name in the corner, confirming he'd been present for this declaration. At the bottom of the box, a newspaper clipping from July 1975 edges, crumbling. Highland Railway decommissioned after derailment kills engineer. Investigation finds operator error. Poor maintenance responsible for accident. William Marshall had died trying to transport this evidence to federal authorities. The train had derailed. The official story blamed equipment failure. But her father's letter had said the brakes were cut, and suddenly the entire architecture of the past 30 years snapped into focus. This box, hidden in the train car that had nearly killed them both, contained proof of murder, disguised as accident. Evidence of environmental crimes that would have destroyed a company and sent executives to prison. Her father had saved it, preserved it, maintained it for 3 decades while the company changed names and continued operating. Emma's hands shook as she photographed every document with her phone uploading to cloud storage before the significance could paralyze her. This wasn't just her father's inheritance. This was responsibility. Power and danger compressed into yellowed paper and damning data. What is it, Mommy? Lily was watching with 8-year-old intensity, knowing something important was happening, even if the details remained opaque. Proof that bad people did bad things, and that Grandpa spent a very long time making sure someone could stop them from doing it again. Emma looked at the documents spread across the dining car table, at the mountain view beyond the windows, at her daughter, who deserved a world where corporations couldn't poison people with impunity. Her father had built them shelter, but he'd also built them a weapon and left instructions for its use. The question was whether she was brave enough to follow through, whether losing her career and marriage and security had stripped away enough fear that she could risk what remained, whether her father's faith in her integrity was justified or tragic optimism from a dying man. Outside, the sun had fully set. Night in the mountains was darker than anything Chicago had offered, no light pollution to soften the edges. Emma lit the camping lantern Margaret had left, battery-powered LED, creating an island of visibility in the freight car. Lily helped her sort supplies and identify what they'd needed first: food, water, purification tablets, matches for the wood stove when morning came. They ate dinner from cans, cold beans, and peaches that tasted fine when hunger was the primary seasoning. Lily asked questions about the train, about whether it had ever actually moved, about how Grandpa had known they would need it. Emma answered what she could and redirected what she couldn't, keeping conversation light even as her mind churned through implications. Eventually, exhaustion claimed Lily, despite the strangeness of their new home. Emma made up a bed in the cleanest corner of the freight car, using sleeping bags and jackets as mattress and blanket. Her daughter was asleep in minutes, the particular stillness of childhood unconsciousness settling over her small frame. Emma sat in the dining car battery lantern on the table beside William Marshall's affidavit and tried to plan. Tomorrow she would go into town, find Frank Morris, and learn the rest of the story Margaret had alluded to. Tomorrow she would figure out water and heating and the 1,000 practical details of living without infrastructure. But tonight, in the silence of her father's sanctuary, Emma let herself fully grieve the man she'd never really known. The engineer who'd measured his love in structural reinforcement and hidden evidence. The father who'd chosen protection over presence, believing that was the only viable option. The stranger who'd known her well enough to prepare for the disaster she'd encountered. She pulled out her phone battery at 18% and typed an email to Walter Monroe. Arrived safely, found the documents. Need to discuss next steps. His response came through almost immediately, suggesting he'd been waiting. Frank Morrison can help. Be careful. The people who killed William Marshall are still influential. They won't welcome scrutiny. Emma closed her eyes, feeling the weight of what she'd inherited settling into her bones. Shelter, yes. Safety, questionable. Purpose, undeniable. Her father had spent 3 decades preparing a weapon he'd never fired, waiting for someone with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. She'd become that person without meaning to integrity, stripping away every false security until only core principles remained. Maybe that was the real inheritance, not the train cars or the evidence, but the understanding that some things mattered more than survival. That being right sometimes required being ruined. That truth had a cost that needed paying regardless. Lily stirred in her sleep, murmuring something about houses and safety. Emma moved to check on her, adjusting the sleeping bag and brushing hair off her daughter's forehead with infinite gentleness. This child deserved better than inherited battles and contaminated legacies. Deserved a mother who chose wisely and protected fiercely. But she also deserved a world where power faced consequences, where companies couldn't poison communities without accountability, where whistleblowers didn't die in convenient accidents. Emma's choice in that Chicago conference room had been about refusing to compromise structural integrity for profit. This was the same decision, just larger scope. She returned to the dining car, to the documents that represented her father's life's work. Tomorrow would bring complications. Tonight in the mountain silence, Emma made peace with what needed doing. Frank Morrison would provide context. Margaret would offer support. The evidence would speak for itself. And Emma Hayes, homeless architect and newly minted heir to 30 years of patient resistance, would finish what her father started, what William Marshall had died attempting, what corporate malfeasance had buried under decades of evolution and name changes. The train cars sat solid around her, engineering transformed into sanctuary, her father's final gift and his final request. She would honor both, whatever the cost. Outside, the Appalachian darkness was complete. Inside, by lantern-run light, Emma began planning for morning. Dawn arrived cold in the mountains, temperature having dropped 20 degrees overnight. Emma woke stiff from sleeping on a bench seat that hadn't been designed for rest, her back protesting the hard surface despite exhaustion's best efforts. Lily still slept in the freight car, bundled tight against the chill that metal walls did little to prevent. The wood stove Margaret had mentioned turned out to be a cast-iron beast installed in the passenger car, venting through a reinforced section of roof. Emma found matches and kindling in the toolbox, along with her father's detailed instructions for fire management in confined spaces. Within 20 minutes, heat began radiating through the car, transforming frozen breath into merely cold air. She left Lily sleeping and walked the perimeter of their new home in early light. The plateau was smaller than it had seemed yesterday, maybe half an acre carved from mountain slope. Rails ended abruptly where the ground dropped away, revealing why the track had been abandoned. Engineering that might have worked in flatter terrain became liability when curves met cliffs. Someone could have extended it, but the chaos would have exceeded any profit from the mining towns the line had served. Her father had chosen well. Remote enough to discourage casual visitors, accessible enough to maintain over decades. The Forest Service road provided vehicle access to within hiking distance, but the final approach required commitment that filtered out anyone lacking serious motivation. Emma found the firewood Margaret had referenced neatly stacked and covered with weatherproof tarp behind the freight car, enough for several weeks if used carefully. Beside it, a rain collection system. Her father had engineered gutters, channeling water from the car roofs into sealed barrels with simple filtration through sand and charcoal layers. City engineering adapted to wilderness necessity. By the time she returned inside, Lily was awake and shivering despite the sleeping bag. Emma got the fire roaring properly, then made breakfast from the canned goods Margaret had left. Oatmeal cooked over the camp stove, sweetened with precious sugar from limited supplies. They ate sitting near the wood stove, warmth slowly penetrating cold muscles. "What do we do today, Mommy?" Emma considered the question while scraping the last of her oatmeal. Practical answer: inventory supplies, establish systems for water and sanitation, make the space minimally functional for long-term occupation. Real answer: go into town, find Frank Morrison, learn what her father had died protecting her from knowing. We need to go into Ridge Valley, get more supplies, and talk to someone who knew Grandpa. The hike down was easier than yesterday's approach, daylight and downhill grade working in their favor. Lily chattered about the forest, pointing out birds and interesting rocks, 8-year-old resilience already adapting to mountain life as normal. Emma tried to match her energy, while mental bandwidth allocated itself to harder problems. Margaret's truck was parked at the trailhead when they emerged from the forest. The woman herself sat on the tailgate thermos of coffee steaming in the morning cold. She'd been waiting then, monitoring. The level of surveillance should have felt invasive, but instead registered as care. Thought you might need a ride into town. Emma accepted the offered coffee cheap gas station blend that tasted like salvation. Thank you, we're managing, but supplies are thin. Margaret's eyes tracked to Lily, calculating needs with the precision of someone who'd raised children herself. Benjamin's Hardware has what you'll need. Tell him I sent you, he'll give you fair prices. Frank's Diner opens at 7. Frank Morrison gets there at 6:30 every morning without fail. The drive into town followed yesterday's route in reverse mountain curves, familiar in daylight. Ridge Valley looked smaller than Emma remembered, a collection of buildings that could fit inside a Chicago city block. But it had infrastructure. They needed the general store, post office, that hardware shop Margaret had mentioned, and Frank's Diner sitting at the corner where Main Street intersected the state highway. Margaret dropped them at the diner's front door. I'll be at the general store if you need anything, but Frank should talk to you alone first. Some stories don't carry well with an audience. The diner interior was pure Americana, vinyl booths, formica counter, rotating pie case near the register. Smell of bacon and coffee, strong enough to trigger Pavlovian hunger despite breakfast an hour earlier. 3 customers occupied stools at the counter, local men in work clothes sharing newspapers and quiet conversation. They looked up when Emma entered collective assessment, so quick in total, she felt cataloged before the door had fully closed. Behind the counter, a man in his 70s worked the grill with practiced efficiency. Lean build, weathered face, gray hair, cropped military short. He glanced at Emma and Lily, expression neutral, then did a double take that suggested recognition despite never having met. His spatula froze midair. The coffee pot in his other hand lowered carefully to the counter. When he spoke, his voice carried the particular rasp of someone who'd smoked for decades before quitting. You're David's daughter. Not a question. Statement of fact delivered with the certainty of someone seeing genetic inheritance written in features. Emma moved to the counter, aware of the other customer's attention, sharpening pretense of reading newspapers abandoned. Emma Hayes, this is my daughter Lily. Frank Morrison nodded, slowly, gaze moving between them like he was solving an equation that had waited years for final variables. Frank Morrison, sit, I'll bring coffee. He poured 2 cups, one regular one, mostly milk and sugar for Lily, and came around the counter to join them in a corner booth away from the regulars. Up close, Emma could see scars on his hands, the kind that came from physical work in dangerous conditions. Railroad work, probably, the same profession that had consumed her father. Margaret called me last night, said you'd found the documents. Emma wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, using the warmth as anchor, while she studied this man who'd apparently been waiting for her arrival. My father's letter said you knew William Marshall, that you could explain the rest. Frank's jaw tightened, decades-old pain surfacing despite the time elapsed. William Marshall was my older brother. He changed his name from Franklin to William when he took over the mining company, trying to distance himself from our father's legacy. I kept Morrison, our mother's maiden name. The revelation reframed everything. Margaret had said Frank knew William Marshall. She hadn't mentioned they were family. Emma processed this new architecture, connecting pieces her father's letter had left deliberately vague. Your brother tried to expose environmental crimes his own company was committing. Frank's expression confirmed what the documents had suggested. Our father built Marshall Mining on exploitation, took shortcuts, bribed inspectors, treated the land and people like renewable resources that never ran out. William inherited the company in 1974, started reviewing operations, and found contamination that would have triggered federal prosecution. He decided exposing it was worth destroying everything our father built. Lily was drawing on a paper placemat with crayons Frank had provided, half listening to adult conversation while creating elaborate mountain landscapes. Emma kept her voice low, aware they weren't truly alone, despite the boost's privacy. The train derailment that killed him wasn't an accident. Brake lines were cut. Your father was in the locomotive, threw himself clear when he realized they weren't slowing. William was in the observation car with all the physical evidence, original test results, photographs, company memos. Everything burned in the wreckage. The investigation found equipment, failure, operator error. Case closed. The bitterness in Frank's voice suggested this wasn't old grief, but active wound. Emma understood. Her father had lived 30 years with survivor's guilt and paralyzed responsibility. Frank had lived with the knowledge that his brother had died for principles their father would have called weakness. Why didn't you or my father go public? You both survived. You knew the truth. Frank's laugh was dark. We tried, filed reports with the EPA State Environmental Office, even contacted journalists. But Marshall Mining had deep pockets, deeper connections. Within a month, I lost my job at the railroad. Your father got photos of you and your mother in the mail pictures taken from a distance, showing your school, your home, your routines. Message was clear. Talk and accidents happen to families. Emma's skin went cold despite the diner's warmth. Lily, 8 years old and unaware of predators that wore suits instead of masks. Her father protecting them by abandoning them, the cruelest mathematics of love. So he stayed silent. Strategically silent. He didn't give up, just went underground. Spent the next 30 years collecting duplicate evidence, documenting every time the company changed names or moved locations. Marshall Mining became Blackwell Development after the bankruptcy in '76, but the executives were the same people. Same practices, different letterhead. The name landed like electricity. Blackwell Development. They're building a resort here now. Frank's expression confirmed she'd connected the crucial thread. Highland Valley Resort. 2,000 acres of luxury cabin spa golf course. Breaking ground in 6 months if permits go through. And those permits will go through because Mayor Bradford's getting $50,000 to make sure environmental assessments come back clean. Emma thought about the documents in the train car, her father's 30-year collection, proving pattern and intent. The land is still contaminated. Has been since the '70s. Runoff from the old mining operation poisoned groundwater for miles. Blackwell knows they've been testing and swapping samples for 5 years, getting ready for this development. Your father documented all of it. Water samples matching contamination signatures from 1975. Bribery receipts, falsified reports, everything needed to stop them. Emma's phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it, focus locked on Frank's weathered face and the implications spreading like cracks in foundation concrete. Why tell me this now? Why not use the evidence yourselves? Because I'm 72 years old and too tired to fight corporate lawyers. Margaret's 68 and has grandchildren she won't risk. Your father's dead, but you... Frank leaned forward, intensity sharpening his features. You already proved you'd sacrifice everything for integrity. Margaret told me about Chicago, the building you wouldn't sign off on. You lost your career standing up to power. That's exactly who William was. That's who your father wanted to be but couldn't because you existed. The weight of inherited responsibility pressed down like atmospheric pressure before storms. Emma had come to Ridge Valley expecting shelter. Instead, she'd found ammunition and a target. They'll come after us, the same way they came after your brother. Frank didn't deny it. Richard Blackwell, William Marshall Sr.'s grandson, runs the company now. He knows about your father's documentation, has known for years. But as long as the evidence stayed buried in train cars nobody visited, it was theoretical threat. You showing up, asking questions, making it active, that changes the equation. As if summoned by mention, Emma's phone buzzed again. She pulled it out, seeing 2 missed calls from an unknown local number and a voicemail. The message was short male voice, smooth with practiced charm. Ms. Hayes, this is Richard Blackwell with Blackwell Development. Welcome to Ridge Valley. I'd love to discuss your inherited property over dinner. Mountain View Restaurant, 6 p.m. tonight. I'll send a car. Looking forward to meeting you. Emma played it on speaker so Frank could hear. His expression darkened progressively through the 30-second recording, recognition and disgust warring across weathered features. That's the grandson. He sounds just like his grandfather, all charm, until you're useful, then pure calculation. Emma deleted the voicemail but saved the number. I'm not meeting with him. You should. Frank's contradiction caught her off guard. Not because he deserves it, but because you need to understand what you're facing. Richard Blackwell is smart, connected, and utterly convinced he's entitled to profit regardless of consequences. Meet him. Let him show you exactly why your father spent 30 years preparing to destroy him. The logic was sound even if Emma's instincts screamed warnings. She needed intelligence on the enemy, and Blackwell had just offered himself for study. What about Lily? I can't bring her. Margaret will watch her. I'll call her now. Frank made the call while Emma explained to Lily that she needed to have a grown-up dinner, boring business, stuff, nothing fun. Her daughter accepted this with the easy trust of children who hadn't yet learned that adults lied about danger to prevent panic. Margaret arrived 20 minutes later, already prepared with an overnight bag containing books and games for Lily. My house has a guest room that's been empty too long. You two should stay there until the train has proper heat. Emma wanted to refuse Pride, suggesting they should manage alone. But Lily's shivering yesterday morning undermined that position. Pride was expensive when children paid the price. Just until we get the wood stove system working properly. Thank you. Practical is better than proud. Margaret's smile held understanding that went beyond this specific situation. Your father learned that eventually. Took him longer than it should have, but he got there. They spent the afternoon at Benjamin's Hardware, where the owner, a man in his 60s with carpenter's hands and skeptical eyes, loaded them up with insulation, weather-stripping batteries, lanterns, rope tarps. Emma paid with the account Walter Monroe had transferred into her name, watching the balance drop from $2,400 to $1,847 with mixed anxiety and gratitude. Benjamin rang up purchases without comment until Emma asked about delivery to the trailhead. Then he looked at her properly assessment, shifting from transaction to evaluation. You planning to stay up there in those train cars? They're home now. Something in his expression shifted, not quite approval, but recognition of commitment. Margaret said you might need help winterizing. I've got time Sunday after church. Can bring supplies and show you how to seal those cars properly. The offer was casual, but Emma heard the weight beneath it. This was the town choosing sides, individual decisions that would accumulate into support or opposition. Benjamin had just declared himself willing to help the woman whose father had spent 30 years collecting evidence against the Valley's biggest employer. I'd appreciate that, thank you. By 6 p.m., Emma stood outside Mountain View Restaurant in clothes Margaret had loaned, slacks and a sweater that fit reasonably well, conservative enough for business without pretending to wealth she didn't possess. The restaurant perched on a ridge overlooking the valley windows, providing panoramic views that probably justified the prices. A black town car idled at the curb, driver emerging to open the back door without asking her name. Blackwell had known she'd come. The certainty suggested confidence or surveillance, possibly both. Richard Blackwell waited at a corner table positioned to see the entrance and the view simultaneously. Late 50s, silver hair, styled casually, expensive suit that probably cost more than Emma had earned in a month before unemployment. He stood when she approached, extending a hand with practiced warmth. Ms. Hayes, thank you for joining me. His handshake was firm, without being aggressive, calibrated to suggest equality between them. Emma sat across from him, accepting a menu from the hovering waiter, while she studied the man who wanted her property and had probably ordered her father's silence through threatened violence. I appreciate the invitation, though I'm curious how you knew I was in town. Blackwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. Ridge Valley is small, word travels, and I make it my business to know when something changes that might affect our development plans. The waiter took drink orders, wine for Blackwell, water for Emma, and retreated. Blackwell leaned back in his chair, relaxed posture that projected control and comfort. I knew your father, briefly back in the 80s. Fascinating man, dedicated to those old train cars beyond what most people would consider reasonable. Emma kept her expression neutral. He had his reasons. I'm sure he did. The question is whether those reasons transfer to you. You've inherited quite a unique property, Ms. Hayes. Remote, no utilities, significant structural challenges. Not exactly ideal for someone in your circumstances. The casual mention of her circumstances, homeless, broke, desperate, landed with precision. Blackwell had researched her. Knew about Chicago, the firing, probably the divorce. Was deploying that knowledge as leverage before May negotiations even began. My circumstances are temporary. The property is permanent. Blackwell nodded like she'd confirmed something he'd expected. Of course, which brings me to my proposal. He pulled out a tablet, swiping to display architectural renderings of Highland Valley Resort. Luxury lodges nestled into mountainsides, spa buildings with natural stone facades, golf course carved from forest. We're developing this valley into a premier destination for ecotourism. Sustainable luxury that honors Appalachian heritage while providing economic opportunity for locals. The renderings were beautiful in the way that concealed violence, nature repackaged as commodity, indigenous landscape transformed into backdrop for wealth. Emma studied them while Blackwell narrated features and amenities, waiting for the actual offer. Your train cars could be the centerpiece, authentic historical preservation integrated into the resort experience. We'd restore them fully, maintain them as a museum or upscale dining venue, and compensate you appropriately for the property. Emma set the tablet down carefully. How much is appropriate? $150,000, cash closing within 30 days, plus residency rights if you wanted to stay on as historical consultant. The number was simultaneously generous and insulting. More money than Emma currently had access to, enough to solve immediate problems and create breathing room. But a fraction of what 3 train cars on Premium Valley Overlook property would be worth once development inflated surrounding values. Blackwell was offering enough to seem reasonable while extracting maximum value for minimum cost. The train cars aren't for sale. Blackwell's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind professional courtesy. Ms. Hayes, be practical. You're homeless with a young daughter. Winter is coming and mountain weather is brutal. Those cars have no heat, no running water, no electricity. What are you going to do when temperatures drop below freezing and the snow starts? Emma met his gaze directly. Figure it out. My father spent 30 years making those cars livable. I think I can manage. Your father, Blackwell's tone shifted subtly, warmth draining towards something harder. David Hayes spent 3 decades on a futile project, died alone in a motel room with almost nothing to show for it. Estranged from his family, no legacy beyond some renovated train cars in the middle of nowhere. Is that the life you want? Is that what you want your daughter to remember about her mother? The cruelty was casual, designed to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. Emma felt anger rising but controlled it, channeling the emotion into clarity rather than reaction. My father built something that mattered. That's more legacy than most people leave. Blackwell leaned forward, charm dropping entirely now that it had failed to produce compliance. There are also legal complications with your claim. The land is national forest. Your father's purchase may not have included usage rights. Mayor Bradford is reviewing the permits now. You could find yourself trespassing on federal land, facing eviction and prosecution. The threat was explicit now, corporate power deploying legal mechanisms to crush individual resistance. Emma thought about William Marshall dying in a train derailment that wasn't accidental, about her father receiving photos of his family as incentive for silence. Blackwell's grandfather had used violence. The grandson preferred lawyers and permits. Same objective, different tactics. Then I'll deal with that when it comes. Blackwell studied her for a long moment, reassessing his initial calculations. You're very much like your father, stubborn, principled, unwilling to see reason. His voice dropped to conversational tone that somehow felt more dangerous than explicit threat. That didn't end well for him. Emma's blood went cold. Oh, and what do you mean? Only that he spent 30 years on a futile project, died alone with nothing to show for his principles except regret and estrangement. Don't make his mistakes, Ms. Hayes. The waiter approached with appetizers. Neither of them had ordered, breaking the tension temporarily. Blackwell's mask of civility returned instantly, thanking the server and making small talk about the restaurant's local sourcing. Emma used the interruption to steady herself, processing the subtext beneath Blackwell's words. He knew about the documents. Had to. The reference to her father's project being futile only made sense if Blackwell understood what David Hayes had spent 3 decades collecting. And if he knew about the evidence, his casual confidence suggested either he didn't believe it could hurt him or he had plans to ensure it never reached anyone who mattered. Emma excused herself to the restroom, needing space to think. In the hallway between dining room and facilities, she pulled out her phone and texted Frank Morrison. He knows about the evidence. Threatened legal action and implied my father's death wasn't coincidental. What do I do? The response came within seconds. Finish dinner, act uncertain. He'll show more cards if he thinks you're wavering. Then get out of there. Emma returned to the table where Blackwell had ordered entrees. She picked at salmon she didn't want, while he pivoted to softer tactics, describing the economic benefits the resort would bring: jobs for locals, infrastructure improvements, how her cooperation would make her a hero rather than obstacle. $250,000, final offer, plus guaranteed employment as historical consultant, $50,000 annual salary. You and Lily would have financial security, housing, health care. Everything you lost in Chicago returned with interest. The offer was expertly calibrated to exploit her exact vulnerabilities. Emma felt the temptation like gravity pulling toward the easy choice. Take the money, walk away, let someone else fight battles that had already cost her father everything and would probably cost her the same. But William Marshall's affidavit was in the train car, testifying that some things mattered more than personal cost. Her father's notebooks documented 30 years of conviction that truth would eventually surface. And Emma herself had already proven in Chicago that she'd choose integrity over security when forced to decide. I need time to think. Blackwell nodded like he'd expected this. Of course, take a week. But understand that development timelines don't wait indefinitely, and legal processes, once initiated, have momentum that's hard to stop. The driver returned Emma to town, dropping her at Margaret's house, where Lily was already asleep in the guest room. Margaret made tea and listened without comment while Emma recounted the dinner, Blackwell's offers and threats, the way he'd implied knowledge about her father's death that went beyond public record. Your father met with Richard Blackwell once. back in 1985, shortly after buying the train cars. Blackwell tried to buy them then. Two offered $10,000, which was real money. David refused. 2 weeks later, someone burned down the work shed where he kept tools and supplies. No evidence, no prosecution. But the message was clear. Emma wrapped both hands around the tea mug. How did my father keep going knowing they'd escalate if he pushed? Margaret's smile was sad. He compartmentalized, convinced himself that documentation was enough, that someday someone braver would use it. Then you got fired for refusing to compromise, and he knew. You were the someone. He just had to prepare everything perfectly, so when you arrived, you'd have what you needed. The responsibility felt crushing. Emma hadn't asked to inherit crusades or corporate enemies. She just wanted shelter for herself and her daughter, space to recover from personal catastrophe. Instead, she'd received ammunition and implicit orders to deploy it. What if I'm not brave enough? What if I take Blackwell's money and walk away? Margaret's expression held no judgment, only understanding. Then you walk away. No one could blame you for choosing your daughter's security, but I don't think you will. Why not? Because you already chose integrity over security once. That's who you are. Blackwell's offering you a chance to undo that choice, pretend Chicago was a mistake you've learned from. But people don't learn to compromise their principles. They either have them or they don't. You do. Emma stayed awake long after Margaret had gone to bed, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop and the cloud backups of her father's documents. She uploaded everything to a second service, then a third, building redundancy against loss or suppression. Sent encrypted copies to the email addresses Frank had provided for environmental attorneys and investigative journalists. If Blackwell escalated beyond legal threats, if something happened to Emma, or the physical evidence, the documentation would survive. Her father had taught her that much: build systems that outlast individuals, create momentum that continues when personal courage fails. By 3 a.m., she'd contacted Lisa Chen, the environmental attorney Frank had recommended. The woman's response came through almost immediately, despite the hours suggesting she maintained irregular schedules. Reviewed your attachments. This is extraordinary. Federal crimes with ongoing pattern across state lines. I'll take the case pro bono if you're willing to testify. But understand, Blackwell Development has resources and connections. This will get ugly before it gets better. Emma typed her response with hands that shook slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline. I'm willing. What do we need to do? Lisa's reply was immediate and pragmatic. Document everything. Keep physical and digital backups in multiple locations. Don't meet with Blackwell and without legal representation. And be prepared for escalation, intimidation, legal harassment, possibly worse. These people have a history of making problems disappear. The warning should have been terrifying. Instead, Emma felt something clarify inside her chest. She'd already lost career, marriage, security, home. Blackwell couldn't take what no longer existed. All that remained was principle and the question of whether it was worth protecting. Her father had answered yes across 30 years of solitary documentation. William Marshall had answered yes with his life. Emma typed one more message before closing the laptop. File whatever needs filing. I'm not backing down. Sunday morning arrived with the first serious cold snap temperature dropping into the 20s overnight. Benjamin showed up at the trailhead at 9 a.m. as promised, truck loaded with insulation and weather stripping. Frank came too, along with two younger men he introduced as his nephews. Margaret brought Lillian enough food to feed an army. They worked all day sealing gaps Emma hadn't known existed, installing insulation between metal walls and interior panels, weatherproofing windows until the train cars felt more like actual shelter than historical artifacts. By sunset, the passenger car retained heat from the wood stove instead of bleeding it into mountain air. Benjamin showed Emma how to manage the fire for maximum efficiency, how to bank coals overnight. So morning restarts were simple. Frank's nephews installed a hand pump connected to the rain barrels, giving them running water that didn't require carrying buckets. Margaret organized the food supplies and taught Lily how to identify which berries were safe if they wanted to supplement canned goods. It felt like community forming around them, individual decisions accumulating into collective support. Emma tried to thank them, but Benjamin waved it off. Your father helped people when they needed it, didn't advertise, didn't keep score. Just fixed things that were broken and asked nothing back. This is paying forward what we owed him. The work party ended with dinner in the dining car, 9 people crammed into a space designed for elegant isolation. They ate Margaret's stew and homemade bread while Frank told stories about the old Highland Line trains that had carried coal and people through these mountains before economics and murder shut everything down. Lily fell asleep against Emma's shoulder, exhausted from a day of playing in the forest while adults worked. Emma carried her to the freight car, tucking her into a bed that was finally warm enough, surrounded by insulation that would hold through winter. Frank lingered after the others had left, standing on the plateau's edge and looking at stars visible in quantity that city dwellers never experienced. Emma joined him, feeling the temperature drop further now that the sun was gone. Blackwell will escalate soon. He knows you're getting help building support. That makes you dangerous instead of just annoying. Emma had reached the same conclusion. What will he do? Legal pressure first, code violations, trespassing, charges, anything to make staying here untenable. Then economic pressure, making sure you can't get work, can't buy supplies, isolating you from community. If that doesn't work. Frank trailed off, but Emma understood. If legal and economic tactics failed, Blackwell had historical precedent for more direct solutions. I sent the documents to a lawyer. She's filing with the EPA and FBI. Frank absorbed this information with something like resignation. Then it started. No going back now. Emma thought about William Marshall's affidavit about her father's notebooks documenting 3 decades of patient accumulation, about corporate malfeasance that had poisoned communities while executives got rich and avoided consequences. I don't want to go back. I want to finish what they started. Your father would be proud and terrified. Frank turned to face her directly. I loved my brother, miss him every day, but part of me is glad he didn't have to see this through. The stress, the danger, the years of fighting people with more money and power, it destroys you even if you win. Be sure this is worth what it'll cost. Emma looked at the train cars her father had spent 30 years preparing at the valley below, where families had suffered contamination while companies profited from poison. At Lily sleeping in the freight car, innocent and trusting that adults would create a world worth inheriting. Some things cost exactly what they're worth. This is one of them. Frank nodded slowly, acceptance without enthusiasm. Then I'm with you, Margaret too. Benjamin probably. Others in town, once they see you, won't fold. But understand, this valley is divided. Half the people see jobs and prosperity from Blackwell's development. The other half remember what Marshall Mining did and don't trust rebranding. You're forcing everyone to choose sides. The first snowflakes started falling as Frank descended the trail, fat and lazy in still air. Emma watched until his flashlight disappeared into trees, then went inside where Lily slept, and wood stove heat made survival feel possible. She checked her phone, 3 new emails from Lisa Chen outlining legal strategy, 5 missed calls from unknown numbers she assumed were Blackwell or his representatives. 1 text from Margaret, Bradford called emergency town meeting for tomorrow night. He's pushing hard on permits. You should come. Emma set an alarm for morning, banked the fire like Benjamin had shown her, and crawled into the sleeping bag beside her daughter. Outside, snow accumulated in silence, first winter storm, announcing itself with the patience that defined mountain weather. Tomorrow would bring confrontation. Town meeting, corporate pressure, community division made public and binding. Emma would have to stand in front of people whose livelihoods depended on Blackwell's development and explain why her father's 30-year-old documentation mattered more than their immediate needs. The prospect should have been terrifying. Instead, Emma felt something crystallize inside her chest, not courage exactly, but clarity about what mattered and what didn't. Blackwell could deploy lawyers and money and permits, but Emma had truth and a dead man's conviction that eventually truth won. She'd find out if that conviction was wisdom or tragic optimism. Either way, the choice was made. The evidence was filed. The battle had started. Everything else was just watching it unfold. The town meeting convened in Ridge Valley High School's gymnasium, bleachers pulled out to accommodate a crowd that exceeded the building's usual capacity. Emma arrived with Lily, Margaret, and Frank entering through side doors to avoid the cluster of people already arguing near the main entrance. The room buzzed with tension that preceded formal proceedings, neighbors taking positions that would calcify into permanent divisions. Mayor Bradford stood at a folding table positioned center court, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits who radiated corporate legal training. Bradford was 50-something, overweight in the way that suggested desk work and expense accounts eye, calculating crowd sentiment with politician's instinct. He called the meeting to order with a gavel that seemed absurdly ceremonial given the setting. We're here to discuss Highland Valley Resort development and address concerns that have been raised. I want to keep this civil and productive. Emma sat in the 3rd row of bleachers, Lily pressed against her side, while Bradford outlined the development project in terms designed to emphasize economic benefit. 200 jobs during construction, 50 permanent positions afterward, increased tax revenue funding schools and infrastructure. He presented glossy renderings on a projection screen. Images of luxury that seemed to promise prosperity would arrive with bulldozers and investment capital. When Bradford opened the floor for questions, hands shot up across the gymnasium. He called on supporters. First, people who asked softball questions about hiring preferences for locals and timeline for breaking ground. Their inquiries allowed Bradford to reinforce talking points about community benefit and sustainable development. Finally, after 15 minutes of choreographed reassurance, Bradford acknowledged Frank Morrison in the fourth row. Frank stood slowly, 72 years settling into his shoulders like accumulated gravity. What about the environmental assessment, the one that found contamination in 2019 before mysteriously getting reversed in 2020? Bradford's expression tightened imperceptibly. The initial assessment used flawed methodology. A second, more comprehensive study found no significant contamination that would prevent development. Frank didn't sit down. Who paid for that second study? Standard practice is for developers to fund environmental assessments. Blackwell Development followed all regulatory requirements. And the $50,000 consulting fee you received from Blackwell that same year, was that also standard practice? The gymnasium went silent. Bradford's face flushed anger or embarrassment, creating visible color change. I provided legitimate consulting services regarding local economic impact. There was nothing improper about that arrangement. Margaret stood before Frank had fully settled back onto the bleachers. I worked at the county clerk's office for 30 years, filed the payment records myself. $50,000 2 weeks before the environmental assessment was approved. You want to tell everyone what economic consulting justifies that much money in a town this size? The crowd's energy shifted, questions spreading through the bleachers in whispered conferences. Bradford hammered his gavel, demanding order, but the damage was done. His credibility had cracked in public financial arrangements that might have remained abstract, now attached to specific numbers and suspicious timing. One of the corporate lawyers leaned toward Bradford, whispering urgently. The mayor nodded, then addressed the crowd with forced composure. These accusations are defamatory and will be addressed through proper legal channels. This meeting is about development benefits, not conspiracy theories from people who oppose progress. Emma felt the moment crystallize, understanding with sudden clarity that she needed to speak now or lose whatever momentum Frank and Margaret had created. She stood hard, hammering against ribs, aware that Lily was watching her mother step into direct confrontation with power. My name is Emma Hayes. My father was David Hayes. He spent 30 years documenting environmental contamination in this valley. Bradford's attention snapped to her like targeting acquisition. Ms. Hayes, your father was a troubled man who lived in abandoned train cars. His personal opinions don't constitute evidence. Emma pulled out her phone, projecting calm she didn't entirely feel. These aren't opinions. They're water samples, geological surveys, chemical analysis spanning 3 decades. He documented contamination patterns that matched signatures from Marshall Mining's operations in 1975. The same contamination your environmental assessment claimed doesn't exist. One of the corporate lawyers stood, voice cutting through gymnasium acoustics with courtroom precision. Those documents, if they exist, were obtained illegally and don't constitute admissible evidence in any regulatory proceeding. Lisa Chen appeared in the gymnasium's back entrance, as if summoned by legal challenge, moving down the center aisle with briefcase and the particular confidence of someone who'd prepared for exactly this moment. Actually, whistleblower protection statutes make them entirely admissible, and the EPA has already opened an investigation based on documentation provided by Ms. Hayes. The announcement detonated remaining pretense of civil discourse. Half the crowd erupted in approval, the other half in protests about outside interference destroying local opportunity. Bradford hammered his gavel repeatedly, achieving nothing except adding percussion to chaos. Richard Blackwell had been sitting in the front row, silent until now. He stood with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to commanding rooms through presence rather than volume. His voice cut through the noise with surprising effectiveness. Can we please maintain some perspective here? Ms. Hayes is understandably attached to her father's legacy, however misguided. But we're talking about documentation from decades ago, collected by someone with no scientific credentials and significant mental health challenges. Emma's anger spiked, protective fury overwhelming strategic caution. My father was a licensed engineer who understood structural integrity and environmental impact better than most people in this room. He documented crimes your family committed, then covered up with money and threats. Blackwell's expression remained placid, but something dangerous flickered behind professional courtesy. Careful with accusations, Ms. Hayes. Defamation carries serious legal consequences. Lisa Chen moved to stand beside Emma, physical positioning that communicated legal representation and preparedness for escalation, as does environmental fraud, bribery of public officials, and witness intimidation, all of which are documented in materials my client has provided to federal investigators. The gymnasium had gone silent again, attention riveted on the confrontation between homeless architect and corporate developer, battle lines drawn in public view. Bradford attempted to regain control, declaring the meeting adjourned and demanding everyone leave in orderly fashion. But order had fractured beyond repair. Outside in the parking lot, clusters formed, immediately supporters gathering around Emma and Frank Blackwell's advocates, surrounding the developer and mayor. The physical separation made allegiances visible, community division that would persist long after this specific conflict resolved. A woman approached Emma tentatively, maybe 40, with exhausted eyes and brittle hope. My daughter died of leukemia when she was 6. 3 other kids in her school did too, all within 2 years. Doctors said it was coincidence, bad luck. Was it contamination? Emma remembered the maps her father had drawn, cancer clusters, overlapping contamination zones with statistical precision that eliminated coincidence. I don't know for certain, but my father's documentation shows correlation between contamination and elevated cancer rates in specific areas. The woman's face crumpled, grief renewed by possibility that tragedy had been preventable. They poisoned us for profit, and nobody cared. Other parents materialized, drawn by recognition of shared experience. Stories emerged in painful fragments: thyroid cancers, birth defects, chronic illnesses, concentrated in families living near old mining operations. Pattern that had been dismissed as statistical noise because acknowledging it would require accountability and compensation. Emma listened, bearing witness to suffering their father had documented in abstract data. Seeing the human cost transform numbers into moral obligation. These people deserve truth and justice, even if both arrived decades too late to prevent harm. Blackwell watched from across the parking lot, face impassive, but Emma saw calculation in his eyes, reassessing threats and adjusting strategy. She'd exposed his family's legacy and turned victims into potential plaintiffs. The fight had escalated beyond property acquisition into existential threat to corporate survival. The drive back to Margaret's house was silent, while Lily, asleep in the back seat, and adults processing what had fractured tonight. Margaret's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, tension visible in shoulders that carried their own history with this valley. Your father tried this once, public confrontation calling out the company. They burned his work shed 2 weeks later. Are you prepared for that level of retaliation? Emma thought about the train cars, about Lily's safety, about the distance between principle and pragmatism. I don't know, but backing down now just means they win again. How many more kids get sick while we stay quiet? Frank turned from the front passenger seat, weathered face, serious in dashboard light. They'll come after you hard. Legal harassment first, code violations permit, challenges anything to make staying here impossible. Then financial pressure, making sure you can't work or buy supplies. If that fails, he didn't finish, but Emma understood. The history was documented in her father's notebooks and William Marshall's death certificate that labeled murder as accident. Blackwell's family had used violence before when legal tactics proved insufficient. Back at Margaret's house, Emma checked her phone to find 17 missed calls from unknown numbers and 5 voicemails she didn't bother listening to. Lisa Chen had sent a text, EP, confirmed they're opening formal investigation. FB, I wants to interview you next week about RICO implications. You stirred the hornet's nest. Stay safe. Emma typed a response. Define safe in this context. Lisa's reply came immediately. Don't go anywhere alone. Document everything. Keep Lily close. These people have resources and motivation to make problems disappear. Sleep came in fragments that night, Emma waking repeatedly to check on Lily and verify door locks, hypervigilance replacing rest. By dawn, she felt hollowed out, running on adrenaline and coffee while pretending normalcy for her daughter's sake. They returned to the train cars that morning, hiking up in cold that promised serious winter within weeks. The plateau was exactly as they'd left it, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Trees that had seemed protective yesterday now felt like concealment for observers. She checked the cars thoroughly, finding nothing disturbed, but unable to relax. Benjamin arrived at noon with more supplies, plus news that spread through town overnight. Bradford's calling for emergency permits review. Says your occupancy violates federal wind use regulations. Forest Service is sending inspectors Friday. The timeline was aggressive, designed to create crisis before Emma could establish stronger legal position. She'd been in the cars less than a week, barely long enough to prove habitation, let alone develop defensible claim to occupancy rights. What happens if they rule against me? Benjamin set down his load of lumber with care that suggested bad news delivery. Eviction order, 30 days to vacate, then federal marshals enforce removal. Bradford's pushing for immediate action, claiming safety violations and environmental concerns. The irony was almost funny, being evicted for environmental violations while trying to expose actual environmental crimes. Emma wondered if Blackwell had scripted this response, or if his influence was so pervasive that local officials automatically deployed tactics serving corporate interests. Lisa Chen called that afternoon with updates that ranged from encouraging to ominous. EPA investigation is proceeding faster than normal, which suggests they found your father's documentation credible. But Blackwell's legal team filed motions challenging evidence, admissibility, and questioning your authority to provide materials. Also, they've initiated defamation lawsuit against you personally, $5 million for damages to corporate reputation. Emma sat on the dining car's observation deck, watching clouds build over distant peaks while calculating impossibilities. She had maybe $800 remaining. A $5 million lawsuit was designed to crush through sheer financial weight, forcing settlement or bankruptcy regardless of merit. Can they actually win? Lisa's pause suggested careful consideration of how much honesty to deploy. Probably not on merits, but they can drag it out for years, accumulating legal fees you can't afford while using discovery to harass and intimidate. It's lawfare using legal process as weapon regardless of actual justice. Emma watched Lily playing below, building elaborate structures from fallen branches and convincing herself they were fortress walls. 8 years old and still believing in protection in adults' ability to keep danger at bay. The innocence was both beautiful and heartbreaking. What do I do? Fight, document everything, show up for every hearing and deposition, make them work for every inch. And hope EPA moves fast enough to make the lawsuit irrelevant by destroying Blackwell's credibility. That night, Emma woke to the smell of smoke. Not wood stove smoke, but chemical accelerant mixed with burning plastic. She grabbed Lily and ran outside to find the freight car engulfed in flames, fire spreading with unnatural speed that spoke of gasoline and deliberate ignition. Frank's training from decades as railroad worker kicked in automatically. Emma ran to the rain barrels, filling buckets while screaming for help she knew wouldn't arrive in time. Lily stood frozen, watching their supplies and her father's tools burn in orange fury that painted the plateau in dancing shadows. Neighbors appeared within 20 minutes, Benjamin, Margaret, others Emma barely knew, forming bucket brigade that fought fire with inadequate resources and desperate determination. By the time flames were contained, the freight car was gutted. Metal shell remained intact, but everything inside had been destroyed. Emma collapsed on cold ground, smoke-stained and shaking. The toolbox was gone. Her father's notebooks documenting 30 years of work consumed by fire that had been set deliberately while they slept. If she hadn't woken, if the flames had spread to the passenger car where they'd been sleeping. Benjamin examined the damage with flashlight and grim expertise. Accelerant poured in a deliberate pattern around load-bearing points. Professional job, they knew exactly where to hit for maximum destruction. Sheriff's deputy arrived an hour later, young woman named Rodriguez, who took statements with professional competence that seemed genuine. But when Emma suggested Blackwell involvement, Rodriguez's expression turned carefully neutral. That's a serious accusation, Ms. Hayes. Do you have evidence linking Mr. Blackwell to this arson? Emma wanted to scream about historical pattern, about intimidation tactics, spanning decades, about corporations that deployed violence when legal methods proved insufficient. But evidence meant proof, and she had none beyond pattern and motive. No, just pattern recognition. Rodriguez finished her report with efficient sympathy. I'll file this as suspected arson. Investigation will proceed, but without witnesses or physical evidence linking specific individuals. The sentence trailed off into bureaucratic helplessness. Emma understood. Even sympathetic authorities couldn't prosecute powerful people without overwhelming evidence, and Blackwell would have been careful to maintain deniability. Margaret drove them back to her house again, Emma and Lily carrying what little they'd grabbed during evacuation. The loss went beyond material possessions. Her father's tools and notebooks represented irreplaceable connection to the man who'd built this inheritance. Burning them was symbolic murder, destroying legacy when the person himself was already gone. But the attack had miscalculated in one crucial aspect. Emma had digitized everything before the fire. Her father's documentation existed in multiple cloud backups, email archives, copies Lisa Chen held in secure storage. Destroying physical evidence accomplished nothing except proving Blackwell's desperation. Lisa confirmed this the next morning, voice tight with barely controlled fury. The arson was stupid. It demonstrates consciousness of guilt and willingness to commit crimes to suppress evidence. FBI is now treating this as active witness intimidation in federal investigation. Blackwell just escalated from environmental fraud to obstruction of justice. Emma sat at Margaret's kitchen table drinking coffee that couldn't penetrate exhaustion. They tried to kill us. Lily could have died. Which is why FBI is assigning protective detail. 2 agents will be with you whenever you're at the train cars or in public. This is serious now, Emma. They've shown they'll use violence. The protective detail arrived that afternoon as Special Agent Marcus Webb and Special Agent Sarah Kim, both professional and armed carrying authority, that transformed Emma's situation from personal struggle to federal case. They swept the remaining train cars for surveillance devices, finding 3 cameras positioned to monitor the plateau's approaches. Blackwell had been watching, waiting for opportunity to strike. Webb documented everything with methodical precision, creating evidence chain that would support prosecution. We're treating this as attempted murder and witness intimidation. Combined with environmental fraud and RICO charges, we're building comprehensive case against Blackwell Development and associated individuals. Emma felt something shift in her chest, fear transforming into cautious hope. She wasn't alone anymore, facing corporate power with only conviction and her father's documentation. Federal resources were now deployed, investigation machinery grinding toward accountability. The EPA inspection of Highland Valley happened 3 days later, teams in hazmat suits collecting soil and water samples across the proposed development area. Emma watched from the train cars now guarded by FBI agents as scientists confirmed what her father had documented across 30 years. Contamination existed concentrated in patterns matching historical mining operations persisting despite decades and corporate claims of remediation. Bradford's emergency permit review evaporated. Forest Service inspectors, who'd been scheduled to declare Emma's occupancy illegal, suddenly found their orders countermanded by federal authorities who recognized the train cars as material evidence in active investigation. Emma's tenancy became protected at least temporarily by the same government machinery Blackwell had tried to manipulate. Richard Blackwell's arrest happened on a Thursday morning, FBI agents appearing at his office with warrant charging conspiracy to commit arson, witness intimidation, and obstruction of justice. The perp walk played on local news' expensive suit and silver hair, framed by agents who demonstrated that wealth couldn't prevent accountability when federal crimes carried sufficient evidence. Mayor Bradford's resignation came the same day his $50,000 consulting fee reframed as bribery, now that EPA had confirmed the environmental assessment he'd approved was fraudulent. The town council accepted his departure without ceremony. Political survival instincts, recognizing association with Blackwell, had become toxic. Emma watched these developments from Margaret's living room, Lily playing with toys, while history unfolded on television. It felt surreal watching the powerful face consequences designed for ordinary people, watching corporate immunity crack under pressure of documentation and testimony. Lisa Chen called with updates that felt like small victories accumulating into actual progress. EPA is issuing stop work order on Highland Valley Resort. Comprehensive environmental cleanup required before any development can proceed. Estimated timeline 3 to 5 years and costs in hundreds of millions. Blackwell Development's stock dropped 40% in 2 days. They're finished as viable company. Emma absorbed this, trying to connect abstract corporate destruction with the concrete reality of her burnt freight car and threatened daughter. What about the defamation lawsuit against me? Withdrawn this morning, their lawyers recognize it's indefensible given everything else. You're clear on that front. The criminal trial began in February federal courthouse, 3 hours away, requiring Emma to testify about her father's documentation and the arson attack. She sat in the witness box with Lily in the gallery, protected by agents, but exposed in ways that made vulnerability acute. Blackwell's defense attorney was everything Emma expected: expensive, aggressive, deploying every tactic to discredit her testimony and question document authenticity. He painted her as vindictive daughter, seeking revenge for abandonment, homeless woman, willing to fabricate evidence for attention and compensation. But Emma had truth and 30 years of her father's meticulous work. She answered questions with architectural precision, explaining how documentation had been collected, how chain of custody had been maintained through digital backups, how the arson attack itself proved Blackwell's consciousness of guilt. The prosecutor introduced William Marshall's original 1975 affidavit, authenticated through forensic analysis and corroborating witnesses. Frank Morrison testified about his brother's death in decades of corporate suppression. Margaret Chen described helping David Hayes collect samples and maintain documentation despite intimidation. Most devastating was testimony from Blackwell's own former employees, contractors, who'd been paid to destroy evidence, officials who'd accepted bribes, scientists who'd falsified environmental assessments under corporate pressure. The conspiracy unraveled in public view, each witness adding details that transformed abstract corruption into concrete criminal pattern. The jury deliberated for 11 hours across 2 days. Emma waited in the courthouse hallway, unable to eat or focus on anything except the question of whether justice would actually arrive or whether Blackwell's resources would somehow produce acquittal despite overwhelming evidence. When the verdict came, the forewoman's voice was steady and clear. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." The courtroom exhaled collectively. Emma felt tears she hadn't known were forming, release that combined grief and relief in something like vindication. Her father's 30-year vigil had mattered. William Marshall's death hadn't been futile, OICO. Corporate power could be held accountable when ordinary people refused to stay silent. Sentencing happened 3 weeks later. The judge, a woman in her 60s with face that suggested she'd seen every variety of human weakness, delivered consequences with precision that felt almost mathematical. "Mr. Blackwell, you've been convicted of environmental fraud, witness intimidation, arson conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. These crimes demonstrate sustained pattern of prioritizing profit over human welfare, valuing corporate success over community health. The court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison without possibility of parole." Blackwell's face remained impassive, but Emma saw something break behind his eyes. 15 years meant he'd be 70 when released, corporate empire destroyed, and personal freedom consumed by consequences he'd spent decades avoiding. The judge continued. "Additionally, Blackwell Development is fined $500 million with mandatory environmental cleanup of all contaminated sites. The company's assets will be placed in receivership pending completion of remediation." Emma left the courthouse with Lily holding her hand, FBI agents flanking them despite reduced threat. Outside media clustered with questions she wasn't ready to answer. She'd won technically. Justice had been served. But the victory felt complicated by everything it had cost and everything it couldn't restore. Spring arrived in the mountains with slow certainty, snow melting into streams that carried winter's accumulation down to valleys below. Emma stood on the observation deck watching ice break up on distant peaks, planning the train car renovation that would transform burnt ruin into museum space. Environmental groups had offered funding for comprehensive restoration, wanting to preserve the cars as monument to whistleblower courage and corporate accountability. Emma had accepted, understanding that her father's sanctuary was becoming something larger than personal shelter. The Highland Pass Memorial opened in August, exactly 1 year after Emma's arrival. The passenger car had been restored to approximate original condition, fitted with climate-controlled cases displaying William Marshall's affidavit, David Hayes' notebooks, photographs documenting contamination and corporate malfeasance. The dining car became community space and research library, panoramic windows, offering views that reminded visitors why preservation mattered. The freight car, deliberately left partially burned, stood as testament to violence deployed against truth-tellers. Placards explained the arson attempt, the intimidation tactics, the personal cost of resistance. Emma had insisted on this, refusing to sanitize history or pretend justice came without sacrifice. 500 people attended opening ceremony, including cancer survivors whose illnesses were now linked to documented contamination, families who'd lost loved ones to diseases that corporate negligence had caused. Dr. Robert Marshall Williams' son, who Emma had only learned about during trial preparation, cut the ribbon with hands that shook from emotion rather than age. "My father died trying to expose environmental crimes he discovered in his family's company. For 48 years, I believed his death was futile, that truth had been buried beyond recovery. David Hayes proved otherwise. Emma Hayes finished what they started. This memorial ensures their courage wasn't wasted." Emma stood with Lily, watching people tour the cars and read documentation that had consumed her father's adult life. The crowd included Frank Morrison, now 73, but still sharp, telling stories about the Highland Line, and William Marshall to anyone who'd listen. Margaret Chen openly acknowledged as David's partner, explaining how they'd maintained documentation despite threats and intimidation. Benjamin brought his granddaughter Emily, 16, and fascinated by environmental justice, already talking about law school and corporate accountability. The next generation, inspired by previous generations' refusal to stay silent. Lisa Chen appeared with news that continued to cascade from the initial victory. 3 other Blackwell development projects have been investigated based on your father's documentation. 2 in Colorado, 1 in Montana. Same contamination patterns, same fraudulent assessments. Federal prosecutors are building RICO case covering 4 states in 30 years of operations. Emma absorbed this understanding that her father's work had implications extending beyond Ridge Valley. How many people were affected? Thousands potentially. Cancer clusters near all the site's health impacts that were dismissed as coincidence. Your documentation is providing evidence, families' need for civil lawsuits against Blackwell's corporate successors. The scope felt overwhelming. Emma had come to West Virginia seeking shelter from personal catastrophe. Instead, she'd inherited responsibility for exposing corporate evil that had destroyed communities across multiple states. The weight should have been crushing. But watching people tour the memorial, reading her father's careful documentation, and understanding that ordinary persistence could defeat institutional corruption, Emma felt something lighter than burden. Purpose, maybe. Connection to effort larger than individual survival. Lily tugged her hand, pulling her toward the dining car where Margaret was serving refreshments. Her daughter had adapted to mountain life with ease that suggested children were more resilient than adults gave them credit for. She had friends in Ridge Valley, now attended the local elementary school, spoke about the train cars as home without the hesitation that had defined their early months. As evening approached and crowds thinned, Emma walked the plateau alone. FBI protection had ended after Blackwell's sentencing agents reassigned to newer threats. The silence felt strange after months of constant surveillance, but also peaceful. She was safe here in the sanctuary her father had built against catastrophe he'd accurately predicted. Margaret found her on the observation deck as sunset painted the valley in amber light. The older woman carried 2 glasses of wine, settling beside Emma with comfortable familiarity. David would be proud, and probably terrified. He never intended for this to become public crusade. Emma accepted the wine considering her father's ghost and the legacy that had exceeded his intentions. He gave me tools to finish what he couldn't. That's more than most parents leave. He loved you, wasn't good at showing it, but the love was real. All of this, Margaret gestured at the restored train cars, the valley below the memorial they'd created, was him trying to protect you and give you purpose simultaneously. Complicated man, complicated gift. Emma thought about the letter he'd left, instructions delivered from beyond death to a daughter he hadn't seen in 15 years. I forgive him for staying away for the silence. He did what he thought necessary. He'd appreciate hearing that, even if he's not around to listen. They sat in companionable quiet, watching light fade from the mountains and stars emerge in quantities that never stopped amazing Emma, despite a year's familiarity. Lily appeared in the doorway, backlit by interior lamps, asking if it was time to go home yet. Soon, baby. Few more minutes. Home. The word had shifted meaning over the past year, expanding from desperate shelter to genuine belonging. Emma had arrived with nothing except inherited train cars and her father's documentation. She'd built something larger, community purpose, legacy that would outlast her individual existence. The Highland Pass Memorial would educate future generations about corporate accountability and whistleblower courage. The environmental cleanup would continue for years, remediating damage that corporate greed had created. Legal precedents established through Blackwell's prosecution would make similar fraud harder to perpetrate and easier to punish. And Emma herself had transformed from homeless architect to director of environmental justice memorial work that paid modestly but mattered deeply. She testified at other trials, consulted on investigations, helped families seeking accountability for contamination their communities had suffered. The train cars sat solid around her, engineering transformed into monument. Her father's 30-year vigil had ended with her arrival. Her own vigil was just beginning, different in scope, but identical in conviction. Some things mattered more than personal cost. Some truths demanded protection regardless of consequences. Lily came back outside, climbing into Emma's lap, despite being almost too big for such comfort. Mommy, can we stay here forever? Emma looked at the valley her father had fought to protect, at the memorial they'd built from his documentation and her determination. At Margaret, who'd loved David despite his absence, at the community that had rallied when corporate power had tried to crush individual resistance. Forever was complicated, dependent on factors beyond anyone's control. But for now, for this moment, watching stars appear over Appalachian peaks, Emma had an answer that felt like truth. Yes, baby, this is home, for as long as it needs to be. The night deepened, temperature dropping toward the comfortable cold that defined mountain darkness. Emma carried Lily inside, banking the wood stove and preparing for sleep in the passenger car that had once been David Hayes' solitary refuge and was now sanctuary for the daughter he'd built it to protect. Outside, the mountains stood patient, impermanent witnesses to human struggle, that mattered intensely to those involved, but barely registered in geological time. The train cars would eventually decay, despite preservation efforts. Documentation would be superseded by newer investigations. Even memories would fade as generations passed. But tonight, in this moment, truth had defeated power. Ordinary courage had produced extraordinary consequences. And that victory, however temporary, was worth everything it had cost to achieve. Emma slept beside her daughter in the home her father had built from abandoned hope, surrounded by evidence that corporate evil could be exposed and punished, protected by community that had chosen justice over expedience. The inheritance had proven larger than train cars or documentation. It was faith that resistance mattered, that silence was collaboration, that one person's conviction could eventually become movement. Some truths refuse to stay buried. Some legacies outlast the people who create them. Emma had become curator of both guardian of her father's life work and architect of future built on its foundation. The mountain stood witness. The stars marked time. And in the train cars on Highland Pass, 3 generations of resistance slept safe in the knowledge that accountability, though delayed, had finally arrived.